If you're not making the money you should from poker, you're probably overcomplicating it. Because even one of the toughest spots to play, out of position, you can crush your opponents by asking at most 3 simple questions. So today, by the end of this video, out of position play will hopefully feel easy. You ready? Let's jump in. All right, so we're gonna start here on the flop. We open pocket nines and the cutoff button is going to call, and the flop comes Jack 9 deuce. What do you know? So once again, we're gonna pull up one of these beautiful flowcharts here. And the first question I would ask is this spot likely to be stabbed by the opponent if we check to them? And I would say our opponents are much more likely to stab if the board is dynamic and wet, and much less likely to stab if the board is static and dry. So let's tackle these first. We all probably know what a wet board looks like and what a dry board looks like. A wet board simply means there's a bunch of draws out there, right? So a board like Jack 9 deuce with a couple of spades, this board is wet because a spade could come in on the turn, bringing in a flush, a queen, a king, a 9, an 8, a 7 could come in, bringing in a straight. Conversely, a board like Ace 7 deuce rainbow, this board is very, very dry. Not a lot of draws out there, only a real gut shot. So wet versus dry simply means, are there a bunch of draws out there? If yes, wet. If no, dry. Static versus dynamic, this is a little bit different, but I find it's probably even more important than wet versus dry. And this just simply means, are the nuts likely to change on the turn? So first, let's look at a dynamic board. And a dynamic board can be either wet, like Jack 9 deuce with a flush draw. This board is dynamic because the nuts are likely to change on the majority of turns. The board could also be dry. A board like 7 3 deuce rainbow. This board is dry. There's only really a straight draw out there, but pretty much every turn card changes the nuts except a 7. So this board is dynamic. And when we look at static, the board could be dry, like our example before, Ace 7 deuce rainbow. This is a static dry board. Or the board could be wet, like Jack 10 deuce with 3 clubs. This board is static because the nuts in Ace high flush is unlikely to change on the turn, but the board is wet because a lot of draws could come in on the turn. The more dynamic and wet the board, the more likely it is to get stabbed. The more static and dry the board, the less likely it is to get stabbed. And one final piece to this puzzle, when we ask, is it likely to get stabbed, we have to consider who is the opponent we are playing against. If we are against kind of a more aggressive player, of course, it is more likely to get stabbed if we check to them. And if we are against a super, super passive nitty player, then in that case, it is less likely to get stabbed. So when we consider this question, is it likely to get stabbed, we're considering a couple of variables all encapsulated in this one question. So let's put some concrete examples to this and make it make sense. All right, so in our first example here, where we open pocket nines from the cutoff and get called by the button, and the board comes Jack 9 deuce. And in this particular scenario, because the board is so wet and so dynamic, I would generally say, yes, this board is very, very likely to get stabbed if we check, unless we're playing against the most passive patty in the entire world. So let's go to our chart here. Is it likely to get stabbed? I would say yes. My strategy here when the board is just very likely to get stabbed, I am just going to be checking my entire range. Why is that? Well, let's go back to the hand. When the board is super likely to get stabbed, and we have a hand like pocket nines, we really benefit from checking here, because when our opponent stabs, we just get to put in a massive check raise with super kind of nutted hands that can play for stacks like pocket nines here. We just get to play a 2-street game and pile in all the money across the flop and the turn. If we just bet ourselves, we wouldn't be able to get in all the money just by going bet when we start off this deep. Same thing here. If we had a hand like pocket kings on this flop, we would also want to check, because our opponents tend to telegraph their hand strength with their sizing. And if our opponent stabs small, we can put in a giant check raise with kings and kind of play for stacks against their jack X, their straight draws, their flush draws, whatever. And if our opponent stabs big, well, we can kind of check call and see what they do on the turn. So we get to kind of play perfectly with our thick value hands. Also, when we have a semi bluff here, like a flush draw, like 8-7 of spades, or when we just have air on this board, like 7-6 of diamonds, we would also want to check, because our opponent gives us so much information by the action they take. So if our opponent stabs small and we have a flush draw, we can often just put in a check raise and try to maximize fold equity against a weak range. And if our opponent stabs large and we have a flush draw, well, we just know we don't have that much fold equity, they're going to have a very strong range, and we can just check call here. And then if we have air and our opponent stabs here, well, we can just check fold. But the really cool thing here is, if the flop goes check and we have air, we just know, because our opponents are over stabbing on this board so much, they just don't have very many strong hands at all, and we can just apply a lot of pressure against a range that can't withstand heat with kind of the zero equity portion of our range. So going back to our chart, you see here, if it's likely to get stabbed, just a ton of benefits to checking our range here from out of position, both when we have value and when we have bluffs. All right, so what if the board is not as likely to get stabbed? Like in this example, we open ace king and the cutoff button calls, and flop comes ace 7 deuce. So back to our chart here, this board is the most static and dry, so most typical opponents on this board will not be stabbing nearly as much. So the next question I would ask here, is the SPR greater than 15? And SPR simply means stack to pot ratio, and we can get this number by dividing the effective stack size by the amount of money currently in the pot. So let's go back to the board here. And we see here 975 divided by 57. Well, we don't need the exact number, but this is greater than 15. It's probably about 17, something like that. Not the best at math, but we can see generally if we're starting 200 plus big blinds deep in a single raise pot, generally the SPR is going to be greater than 15. And if we're starting 150 big blinds or less, then generally the SPR will be less than 15. So back to our chart here. Yes, the SPR is greater than 15. And we see here we want to bet when we have thick value, and we want to check when we have hands that can play for stacks, thin value, showdown value, draws, and air. And just a quick note, CPFS or can play for stacks, these are essentially hands that are just comfortable piling in all the money. They're fist pump getting in all the money right now. So these are the strongest of the strong hands in our range. So let's go back to our board, and first let's classify this hand, and I would say this is thick value. It's not necessarily a hand that can play for stacks. If we get raised on this board, we're not fist pump getting the money in, right? We lose to ace 7, ace deuce, pocket 7s, pocket deuces. This is not a hand that can play for stacks, but definitely a thick value hand. The reason why we just want to come out and consider betting this hand ourselves, we already deduced that our opponents aren't going to be stabbing nearly as much on this board. And second of all, even if they are stabbing with their ace X a high percentage of the time, this is not the situation and not the stack depth and not the hand type that we are going to be able to play for stacks. For example, if we would check to our opponent and if they would stab on this board, and if we would check raise, we would just generate a ton of folds from weaker ace X. Even if our opponent has a hand like ace jack or ace 10 or something like that, if we check raise, bomb the turn, and jam the river, well, there's just not many draws out there that our opponent can put us on, and we're probably just going to be getting a lot of folds. So my preferred line at this SPR is just taking a bet line with our hand and just betting the flop, betting the turn, and betting the river. And sure, we can't necessarily get in all the money this way, especially if we want to get called by a hand like ace jack or ace 10. But in some situations, even when we have a super strong hand, it is just not viable to be able to play for all of the money all of the time. Now let's say same situation, instead of having a thick value hand, we have a hand that can play for stacks, a hand like pocket 7s here. So let's go back to our chart, and we see here when we have 7s, which is a can play for stacks hand, we want to check here. So why do we want to check even if this board is not nearly as likely to get stabbed when we're just betting when we have a hand like ace king or ace queen? Well, the thing about having a hand like pocket 7s here is we can absolutely cooler our opponents when they also have a strong hand. If our opponent has a hand like ace 7 or ace deuce or pocket deuces, or even a hand like ace king or ace queen that they just flatted with pre-flop, which happens all of the time in live poker, by checking here with the absolute top of our range, we just get to make sure when our opponent also has a very strong hand, we get to play for all of the money. And pocket 7s is a hand that is quite comfortable when all the money goes in. We're just going to have the best hand 99.9% of the time. Whereas if we have a hand like ace king or ace queen on this particular board, if all the money goes in, we are probably value owning ourselves at a high frequency. And then what if we had an air ball here, a hand like jack 10 of clubs or something like that on this flop? Well, let's go back to our chart, and you see here with our draws, with our air, we are also checking here, because even if the board is not exceedingly likely to get stabbed, our opponents are still going to put in money when they have their super strong hands. Their hands like 2 pair, their hands like sets, their hands like top pair, top kicker, top pair, good kicker. And yes, they'll occasionally check back a medium or weak top pair, but they're not going to have these super strong hands in their range most of the time when they check back, even on a board that is this dry and static. So when our opponents check back, we get a little bit more information with our bluffs, with our air, and then we can start applying pressure across turns and rivers, knowing that we're just not going to run into the top of their range nearly as often. All right, let's look at one more example. Again, we open in the cutoff button, calls, ace 7 deuce. And if you notice this time, we only start the hand 500 effective. So let's go back to our chart. Is it likely to get stabbed? Once again, probably not as likely when the board is this static and dry. Is the SPR greater than 15? Back to the flop. And again, when we're looking at SPR, we're looking at the effective stack. So we want to be looking at the opponent's stack. And in this situation, no, the SPR is not greater than 15 because our opponent started off only 100 big blinds deep. So back to our chart here, we would say no, the SPR is not greater than 15. And in this particular situation, you see we're making a deviation here, and we are also betting our can play for stacks hands along with our thick value. We're still checking our thin value, our showdown value, our draws, and our air here. Those hands just benefit from checking a lot. But why are we checking our can play for stacks hands when the SPR is greater than 15 and betting our can play for stacks hands when the SPR is less than 15? And as we go back to the board here, we see because of the SPR we started this hand with, we can just very easily go bet, never putting in an over bet, having less than a 75% pot size bet on the river. We can just very easily get in all the money by going bet ourselves. We don't really have to worry about bad turn cards, bad river cards. We're just trying to make sure that our opponent's never going to fold a hand like ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, whatever. And if we go bet, that is the way to minimize fold equity. We don't really need a check raise to get in all the money. money here. Okay, so what about this scenario when we have pocket nines on a board that is likely to get stabbed? And we see here again, our opponent starts off this hand relatively shallow, only about 100 big blinds. So back to our chart, and you see here when the board is likely to get stabbed, we'd still be checking our entire range here, even when our opponent is shallow. So why is that? Let's go back to this example here. And the reason is when the board is particularly wet and dynamic like this, even though we can get in all the money by going bet, bet, bet ourselves, when the board is just so exceedingly likely to get stabbed, it's just really nice to be able to put in a check raise and play either a 1 or 2 street game. Because if our opponent does have a hand like ace jack for top pair, top kicker, the turn could bring in a straight, it could bring in a flush. Our opponent could get a little bit more squeamish with their hand. And if we're trying to play a 3 street game, they may just not put in all the money by the river. Same thing, if our opponent has a draw here, an open and straight draw or an ace high flush draw, and we just go bet, 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 we're probably not getting in all the money unless they get there, right? But by checking, even when our opponents are shallow, when the board is exceedingly likely to get stabbed, we often just get to play a 1 or 2 street game. You see here, we check raise big on the flop, and we can just pretty much jam any turn here, easily get the money in, and not have to worry quite as much about bad cards coming where our opponents are going to fold hands that we have drawing very thinly. So you see here, once again, the big picture question we ask on the flop is it likely to get stabbed? And if yes, we are just going to check our range. And if no, we ask, is the SPR greater than 15? And if yes, we're going to just be betting our thick value and checking everything else. And if the SPR is low, if we are more shallow with our opponents, then we're just going to be betting our can play for stacks and our thick value and checking everything else. So this is how I think about flops and decide when to check and when to bet. Now let's talk about playing flops after we have checked and our opponent stabs. All right, so the very first question I like to ask when we check to our opponent as a pre-flop raiser and then they stab is just very simple. What size did they stab? Let's go into a couple examples. I will put this into practice. All right, so we open pocket eights in the cutoff. Button is going to call. Flop comes queen 8-4. And is this board likely to get stabbed? I would say yes. So we're going to check our entire range here. Now our opponent stabs for $40 into 57. Back to our handy dandy chart here. What size did they stab? Well, this is a pretty big size, over 2/3 pot on the flop. I would classify this as big. You see here, we've got 3 actions. We can either check raise, check call, or check fold. And when they stab big, this just means our opponents in general have a range that is pretty strong. Now, this doesn't mean they always have a strong hand and they never have a weak hand, but generally when opponents stab big when we check to them, they're just going to have too much strong stuff in their range and not quite enough weak stuff. Even if it's just weighted 10, 15, 20% too much strong stuff. I'm not saying they never have a weak hand or they always have a strong hand. It's just when they stab big, their range is going to be very strong. So you see here, we're check raising whenever we have a can play for stacks hand or a combo draw. So back to our board here, and a hand like pocket eights, definitely a hand that can play for stacks, so we would be check raising. Would also be check raising here if we had a hand like jack 10 of hearts or 10-9 of hearts or 4x of hearts. If we had a combo draw on this board, would also be check raising.
Well, Mark, they have a super strong range here. Why are we check raising with a draw if they're just not going to fold?
Good question. And the answer to that is because when we have a combo draw here, we just have so much equity in our hand against their range. Even if our opponent has a hand like ace queen here and we have a hand like jack 10 of hearts, we are basically flipping with our opponent. The more equity in our hand we have, the less fold equity we need. So even though we don't have a ton of fold equity when they stab big, even if we just have a shred of it, remember I said they don't always have strong hands when they stab big, it's just generally strong hands. Even if they fold 7, 8, 12, 15% of the time by the river, when we have a combo draw, we're absolutely printing because we're going to get there 40, 45, 50% of the time ourselves. And then if we can just pile on an additional 10 to 15% fold equity on top of that, well, we are just printing money with our big draws here. You see here, going back to our chart, we're going to call here when we have thick value, thin value, or high equity draws. So going back to this board, if I did have a thick value hand, a hand like king, queen, or something like that, I would be just check calling here because when our opponent chooses this big size, they're representing a super strong range. And if we just start piling money with king, queen, we're going to be value owning ourselves probably a little bit too much for my liking. So thick value with king, queen, we'll just be calling here. We're going to see what our opponent does on the turn. They will generally be face up and we're going to be able to play perfectly. If we do have a thin value hand here, maybe a hand like ace 8, I would also be calling on this turn. Our opponent could still have some draws that we're ahead of. Once again, they're generally going to be more face up on the turn with their double barrel. So our thin value hands, a hand like ace 8 here, would probably just be calling once to see what happens on the turn. High equity draws like ace high flush draws, these hands have a little bit less equity than our combo draws, so would just be check calling with these as well. Once again, the more equity in our hand we have, the less fold equity we need. In this particular case, even with an ace high flush draw, just don't think we have enough fold equity to make that a profitable check raise. Going back to our chart here, you see we're just check folding when we have showdown value or a low equity draw. So back to the hand here, I would just be check folding if we had a hand like ace jack high or a hand like pocket 5 5s or pocket 7s in this particular spot, because when our opponent stabs big, their range is strong, so we can just fold out the bottom of our range. All right, so we talked about what to do when our opponent stabs big. Now, what if our opponent stabs small? So let me give you a few examples. All right, so we open 8-9 of hearts in the cutoff, button calls, flop comes 10-6-5. We go back to our flowchart. Is it likely to get stabbed? Well, the board is wet and dynamic. This player is not particularly passive in my made up example. So yes, the board's likely to get stabbed. We are just going to check here. And now our opponent stabs for 20 into 57. Back to our chart here. And when they stab small, the next question I ask is, what is the board type? Well, going back to our board, 10-6-5 with a flush draw, this board is wet and it is dynamic. And you see here, when the board is wet and dynamic and our opponent stabs small, we are just putting in a ton of check raises. Our can play for stacks, our combo draws, our thick value, our high equity draws, and our low equity draws are all check raising here. So if we had a can play for stacks hand here, a hand like pocket 6s, we would be check raising.
Well, Mark, why are we check raising when our opponent stabs small and they obviously have a weak range?
And my answer to that is, just because our opponent stabs small doesn't mean they don't have some inelastic hands in their range that just aren't folding to a check raise no matter what. Our opponent probably doesn't have a lot of top pair or over pairs or 2-pair or sets here when they stab small. Might they have a hand like an open in straight draw? Might they have a hand like an ace high flush draw? Might they have a hand like 5x of diamonds? None of these hands are generally going to fold to a check raise, so we just want to maximize value against the inelastic portion of the range when we have a hand like pocket 6s here. And if our opponent stabs small and they have a hand like ace 4 of hearts that they're just monkey stabbing, or a hand like pocket 4s, it doesn't matter. They're probably not putting in any more money no matter what we do. So we may as well check raise large here when we have a can play for stacks hand and maximize value against the inelastic portion of their range that is just going to call no matter what on this flop. When we have a combo draw here, a hand like 8-7 of diamonds, we would also want to be check raising. This hand just has a ton of equity. And once again, we're gonna have more fold equity when they stab small. And when we have 8 high with the combo draw, that's pretty good for us. So we wanna maximize the fold equity across turns and rivers. We just wanna be putting in a check raise when we have a combo draw. Now, if we have a high equity draw, a hand like ace 3 of diamonds, also wanna be check raising, because once again, the more fold equity we have, the less equity in our hand we need. And we think we have a little bit more fold equity when our opponent stabs small. So our high equity draws like ace 3 of diamonds, or even our low equity draws, a hand like 8-9 of hearts here, could also be check raising with these hands, because we can just apply a lot of pressure and get a lot of folds specifically across turns and rivers. Going back to our chart, you see when we have thin value or showdown value, we're just check calling. And once again, when we have air, we are just check folding. All right, so this is how to play facing a stab when the board is dynamic and wet, but what about if the board is static and dry? All right, so this time we're gonna open with 6-5 of diamonds in the cutoff, button is going to call, king 8-4, and we're gonna go to our initial chart here for our flop decision. Is it likely to get stabbed? I would say this board is more static and dry, so it's less likely to get stabbed. We're gonna know here just for shits and giggles. Is the SPR greater than 15? Well, yes, we started this hand 200 big blinds effective, so yes, we would see here we would check with pretty much everything in our range except our thick value. We have a draw here, so we would be checking. Back to the board, we check, and now our opponent stabs small. So now back to our flop facing a stab flow chart. Our opponent has stabbed small. What is the board type? Well, now the board is static and dry. And when the board is static and dry, you see here we're only check raising can play for stacks and combo draws, which is very, very similar to what we do when they stab big. So why when the board is static and dry and they stab small, we're being so careful about the hands we check raise, or when the board is dynamic and wet and they stab small, we are just check raising with impunity. And going back to our board here, the answer is the more static and dry the board, the less our opponents are going to telegraph the strength of their hand with their size. So on a board like this, king 8-4 rainbow, the board is super static, it's super dry, there's really only gut shots out there, not much for our opponents to worry about. Our opponents just don't telegraph their hand strength with their sizing nearly as much. If our opponent does have a strong hand like ace king or pocket 8s or pocket 4s, they may well take this small size, because generally fear drives players' decisions and they are not fearful of a bad turn card coming in if they have a strong hand on this board. So when the board is static and dry, we just can't take as much information away from the size that our opponents use. Going back to our flow chart here, you see we're just check raising our can play for stacks and combo draws. We're going to be a lot more careful on these static dry boards because our opponents can still just have a strong range. So we don't want to go balls to the wall when we have low equity bluffs here when our opponent stabs small. All right, next let's talk about how to play turns after check calling the flop. So let me show you an example. So we're gonna open 10-9 of hearts here in the cutoff. Opponent calls on the button. Flop comes king 9-4. And first we wanna start with our flop decision-making point here. You see here on the flop, we ask, is it likely to get stabbed? The board is wet and dynamic, so I would say yes. So we are just checking our entire range here. Back to the board, we are going to check. Our opponent is going to stab big here for $40. Now we're gonna go to our flop facing a stab flowchart. We see our opponent has stabbed big. We are going to check call here when we have a thin value hand. And back to the board, 10-9 of hearts, second pair, kind of a thin value hand. So we are going to put in the call. Now the turn is a deuce. We check it over to our opponent once again, and we face a double barrel. How do we play these turns after we check call on the flop? All right, so you see here on the turn, the question we're asking is what size did they stab on the flop? And generally, because our opponents are going to put too many of their strong hands in the big size and too many of their weak hands in the small size. So this question, often just as important or even more important than what size did they double barrel on the turn, is what size did they initially stab? We see here in this particular example, if we go back to the flop here, you see here our opponent stabbed big. We go to a turn, and now our opponent is going to double barrel. So back to our flowchart here, what size did they stab on the flop? Well, they stabbed big. So you see here on the turn, we are pretty much only check raising once again top of range. Our can play for stacks and our combo draws. We're going to check call with our thick value, our thin value, and our high equity draws, and we are just check folding our showdown value and our low equity draws. So we are just continuing relatively tight here on the turn. So going back to this particular example, going to be very hard for us to turn a can play for stacks hand. If we had a hand like king deuce or something like that and we turn to pair, you get the point. Combo draw, maybe we turn a hand like ace 5 of diamonds, ace 3 of diamonds, ace deuce of diamonds, something like that. When we have so much equity in our hand, we just don't need a shit ton of fold equity. So we would just put in the check raise when we have a combo draw. We would also just put in the check raise when we have a can play for stacks hand. We have thick value, a hand like king queen, pocket aces. We are just check calling once again on this turn. And if we have thin value, now I would say our hand 10-9 of hearts, maybe thin value on the flop, but facing a big stab on the flop, a double barrel on the turn, I would downgrade a hand like 10-9 of hearts, maybe to showdown value. Maybe a thin value hand on this turn would be a hand like king 10 or king 6 suited, maybe a weak top pair, something like that. So 10-9 of hearts, probably downgraded to showdown value on this turn. And as we see here, going back to our chart, our showdown value and our low equity draws are just going to be folding on the turn. Another example here, we open ace 4, our opponent calls. Going to our initial flow chart here, is it likely to get stabbed? Yes, so we are going to check. Our opponent stabs small, and going to our facing a stab on the flop flow chart. When our opponent stabs small, we are calling with kind of our showdown value hands, which is what we have here. So we are going to call. The turn is a 4. And now before we act on this turn, let's go over to our flow chart once again. So you see here, when our opponent stabs small on the flop, we have an additional option here on the turn. And I've just put in here the option to just come out and lead ourselves when we have strong hands, when we have can play for stacks, and when we have thick value hands. You see here, when our opponent stabs big on the flop, I'm just never coming out and leading. But when our opponent stabs small, I'm just coming out and putting in money ourselves when we have a hand that is thick value or can play for stacks. Why might we just want to come out and bet when we bink trips here on the turn after our opponent stabs small on the flop? Because the board is wet and dynamic and our opponent stabs small, they just don't have nearly as many strong hands in their range. If our opponent did have a hand like ace queen, king queen, queen jack, they would probably just come out and bet bigger on the flop a lot of the time. If our opponent does have a draw, oftentimes on these turns, because live players are more passive, if they have a straight draw, if they have a flush draw, if they just have a hand like pocket tens or something like that, they're just going to check back quite often on this turn after they stab the flop small. So when we have a hand that can play for stacks or thick value, a hand like ace 4 here, we just want to come out and lead ourselves, because even though our opponent would check back here often, if they had a hand like pocket tens or a flush draw or an open and straight draw, that doesn't mean they're folding to a single bet. And the way to minimize fold equity is often just to come out and bet ourselves when we bink a very strong hand on the turn after check calling on the flop. Okay, but what if we open a hand like jack 10? We check on the flop, our opponent stabs small, we're just going to call with a low equity draw, and now we hit a combo draw on the turn. Well, back to our flow chart here, you see here we're check raising when we have these combo draws on the turn. And the reason behind this is the way to maximize fold equity, particularly against a weaker range, which our opponents are going to have when they stab small on the flop, is to put in the check raise. The way to minimize fold equity is just to come out and bet ourselves. The way to maximize fold equity is to go for the check raise. And going back to our hand here, when we have a combo draw, when we have jack high, our goal is to generate as many folds as possible. So the way to do that would be to check on the turn, let our opponent stab, put in that big boy check raise, and we can just generate a lot of folds. And I know you may be saying, well, Mark,
You said our opponents aren't going to be double barreling on the turn all that often when they choose a small size on the flop.
that is true. One of two things happen here on this turn. Number one, our opponent does double barrel. We get to check raise the turn, apply a ton of pressure, and just get a lot of folds. Number two, our opponent checks back, which means we just get to realize our equity for free. And if we hit on the river, we can bet. And even if we miss on the river, we can often just bluff small, get our opponent to fold a bunch of their weak stuff, like gut shots that beat us or ace high flush draws or whatever. By checking here with our combo draws, a lot of good things happen for us. And again, going back to our flowchart, why when our opponent stabs big on the flop, do we just want to check again when we have our can play for stacks hands on the turn and not just come out and lead? Well, let's look at this example. We open ace 4 of clubs in the cutoff, opponent calls on the button, king 9-4, we check, our opponent stabs big, we call here on the flop. Now the turn is a 4, so why would we want to check here again instead of just coming out and donking? Because when our opponent stabs big on the flop, they are just going to have a stronger range, which means they're much more likely to double barrel here and put in money for us. When our opponent stabs big on the flop, that means they're going to have hands like ace king, king queen, king jack, maybe some ace high flush draws, maybe some combo draws. And sure, check raising maximizes fold equity, but when our opponent has a very strong range, number one, we expect them to just put in more money for us almost all the time when we check here. And number two, we just don't expect them to fold all that much, even to a check raise when they have a strong range. So by checking here on the turn, our opponent's often going to bet for us after they stab big on the flop. We can put in a check raise and we're just able to pile in all the money across the turn and the river and oftentimes play for stacks and get all the value from our opponents when we know that they have a strong range. Okay, so you see here on the flop with our initial decision, when we are facing a bet on the flop and after check calling on the flop, we can often come to a very, very good answer by asking just 3 questions or less. So we've also built out very, very beautiful, simple flowcharts for what to do after we check raise on the flop and now we are on the turn. And my favorite part, why this strategy is so profitable. How do we play turns after the flop goes check, check? So if you want all of the sauce and all of the beautiful flowcharts, consider joining one of our 28-day bootcamps or 7-day crash courses and you will get it all. But hopefully these 3 flowcharts we've discussed and how to come to a very effective answer by asking just 3 questions or less gives you a running head start and turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle